In the quiet stretches of the galaxy where peace had reigned for eons, an unexpected signal emerged from the unknown, a signal unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever encountered. No one knew where it came from, or who sent it, but it was a warning. A pulse of energy that seemed to reach beyond the stars themselves. Soon after, a massive warship appeared on the Council's radar, an enormous vessel of unknown origin, heading straight for their doorstep. And the species behind it. Humanity, long thought forgotten and irrelevant, had returned. And they were not here to negotiate. They were here to conquer. The galaxy had known peace for centuries, a peace forged through the collective efforts of countless species in the ever-watchful eye of the Galactic Council. It was a peace built on diplomacy, compromise, and a healthy respect for one another's quirks, like the Zarkians' obsession with lumpy pillows or the Murden's habit of making diplomatic gestures by sneezing. These minor eccentricities were part of the galaxy's charm. But then, the signal came, a strange, irregular pulse, flickering through the vast emptiness of space. It was so peculiar that it couldn't be ignored, but no one could make sense of it. For weeks, the Council scrambled to decode the transmission, calling it a glitch, a rogue signal from a distant, unknown source. A bug in the system, they thought. But when the signal began repeating, growing stronger and more distinct, the Council's mood shifted from nonchalance to mild concern. After all, in space, no one can hear you scream unless it's a transmission, and then apparently everyone's listening. The Galactic Council's elite members met in hushed chambers, pacing nervously as if the sound waves could somehow physically harm them. They weren't used to feeling vulnerable. They were the caretakers of the universe's peace, its most powerful force. And the notion of an unknown signal daring to disrupt their calm was enough to rattle even the most seasoned diplomat. The humans, in particular, had always been a subject of bemusement among the galactic elite. Their spacefaring days had long since passed. Their fleet, once a laughable collection of poorly designed ships, had vanished into the cosmic ether decades ago. The Council's greatest hope was that humanity had simply given up on the stars and settled for their quaint little corner of the galaxy. Perhaps they had evolved into a species that preferred the comfort of sofas and take-out food, content to let the rest of the galaxy handle the heavy lifting. At least that's what everyone thought. Then came the signal. And then silence. Not just any silence, but the kind that creeps under your skin, making you feel as though something is watching you. The Council's communications officers checked their systems, worried that a simple malfunction might be the culprit. But no. The silence stretched on, an ominous pause that hung in the air like an unanswered question. It wasn't long before they realized that something was approaching. Something big. The first reports came in from a distant outpost, large object detected on the edge of Council space. Not responding to hails, does not match any known vessel profile. Panic rippled through the command center. The object, whatever it was, moved with unnerving precision toward the heart of the galaxy, undeterred by the usual traffic lanes or space protocols. It was a ship, no doubt, but not just any ship. It was human-made, and suddenly the Council found itself in a position it hadn't been in for centuries. Uncertain. What was it? A relic? A forgotten warship from humanity's past? Or something new? Something far more dangerous? They weren't sure, but the words on every officer's lips were the same. It's human. And that was enough to send the Council into a tailspin. The humans had never been a threat, or so they thought. The giant shadow grew larger on the sensors, its outline unmistakable as it approached the center of Council space. Every officer in the Galactic Council's fleet watched, frozen, as the radar pinged, louder and more persistent with each passing second. The object had no name, no classification, just an anomaly, a massive unknown. There were no communication signals, no attempt at contact. The Council's best analysts scratched their heads, scrambling through archives, trying to match the shape with any known vessel, but they came up empty. It wasn't a species they recognized, and it wasn't a ship they had cataloged. The galaxy's once stable order was now hanging by a thread, the very thread they were used to cutting. The Council commanders were quick to assume the worst. The idea that something was headed toward them without any regard for diplomacy was as offensive as a Zarkian diplomat sneezing in the middle of a treaty signing. The situation was too clear. This was an invasion. It had to be. The species behind it didn't even bother to announce its arrival. How disrespectful. How human. And so the fleet was mobilized in a panic. Every ship, every cruiser, every defense system was readied. They would defend the galaxy as they always had, by force, if necessary. And if the invaders had any hope of getting through, they were going to meet the Council's firepower head-on. But then something strange happened. The enormous warship didn't veer off course. It didn't slow down. It didn't speed up, it just kept coming. No flashy lights. No dramatic statements. It was simply there like a dark cloud hovering over a picnic. And the closer it got, the more unnerving it became. The Council's sensors, which could detect even the faintest blip in the universe, started to malfunction. The ship's trajectory was precise, eerie, and uncaring. It didn't communicate, didn't give any sign of life, yet its presence was undeniable, and it was now too close for comfort. A few minutes later, the ship was within range of the nearest galactic outpost. The Council's fleet sat in uneasy anticipation. Would it attack? Would it negotiate? Or what was worse, would it simply ignore them entirely, as if the Council didn't even deserve a response? Perhaps the humans had mastered the art of ignoring the rest of the galaxy the way some species had perfected the art of passive-aggressive intergalactic gardening. But as the ship passed the outpost, it didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge the fleet at all. It simply continued, straight into Council territory. That was when the Council realized just how foolish they had been to dismiss humanity as insignificant. This was no random signal, no forgotten relic. It was an intentional display of power. The ship wasn't here to negotiate peace. It wasn't here to establish trade routes or offer diplomacy. No, this was something else. This ship, this human vessel, was a statement. And if the Council had any hope of understanding it, they were about to learn that the humans didn't play by the same rules they did. The ship continued to glide through space, silent, unyielding. The Council, in all their wisdom and technological superiority, had no idea what they were dealing with. One thing was certain, the galaxy was about to be reminded of humanity in the worst way possible. The humans were not just back, they were in charge. The Council's initial confusion turned into genuine panic when they realized what was happening. This wasn't just a relic of a bygone age, this was humanity, returning with something far beyond anything the galaxy had seen. The ship wasn't just big, it was enormous. It dwarfed anything the Council had ever built. Its surface was sleek, almost as if it had been carved out of the fabric of space itself. There were no signs of age or rust, no remnants of a forgotten warship. This was a new breed of craft, something that had no place in the galaxy they knew. Something that was, at that moment, cutting through space like a hot knife through butter. The Council's initial reaction was disbelief. How is this possible? They whispered to each other. How did they? They couldn't even finish the sentence. For centuries, humanity had been a quaint curiosity. The stuff of legends. The ones who had gotten drunk on their first few interstellar flights and promptly crashed into their own moon. They hadn't been seen for years, and their technology had always been laughably outdated. When the Council first heard rumors of human space exploration, they treated it like a bad joke, an amusing, inconsequential blip on the galactic radar. Sure, humans had their moments, a few decent inventions here and there, some oddly creative art. And, let's be honest, the finest coffee in the known universe. But warships? Come on. The thought was absurd. But now, they were looking at this monstrosity of a ship, and everything they thought they knew about humans and about themselves was crumbling faster than a poorly made asteroid station. As the massive vessel continued its approach, the Council scrambled to analyze the situation. No one had seen any sign of human military activity for centuries. The last official contact had been before any of the current Council members were even born. The human fleets that had once dotted the galaxy like dust specks had vanished long ago, their ships forgotten and their technology deemed obsolete. What had happened to them? Had they evolved? Had they suddenly figured out interdimensional travel while everyone else was busy perfecting their diplomatic handshakes? How had they gone from the galactic punchline to the terrifying headliner? The answer was simple, and it terrified the Council more than they cared to admit. Humanity had not evolved. They hadn't learned through peaceful negotiation or trade. No, they had learned through war. The humans had spent their centuries of isolation perfecting a form of combat unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. They had studied the galaxy, and while everyone else was busy sitting around in their cushy council meetings and tea ceremonies, humanity had been quietly building a war machine that would make even the most hardened soldier flinch. And now it was here, hanging above the galaxy like a storm cloud. The ship wasn't showing off its capabilities, it was simply there, looming over the Council, its silence more terrifying than any weapon could ever be. It didn't need to make a statement. Its very presence was the statement. The humans were no longer a joke. They were the punchline and the executioner. The Council knew it was too late for diplomacy. The humans had returned, not to negotiate peace or offer their goodwill. They had returned to remind the galaxy who had always been the apex predators, the true masters of space. And this time there would be no more mistakes. The Council, in all their technological might, had underestimated humanity. And now they were about to find out just how costly that mistake would be. The human warship moved closer, and with each passing moment, the unease within the council grew. It was as if the ship existed in its own reality, a reality that mocked the galactic order they had spent millennia perfecting. The usual hum of galactic traffic, the predictable ebb and flow of data streams, was replaced by an unsettling silence, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath. And the ship? It didn't even bother to acknowledge them. It just glided through the void like an ancient predator stalking its prey. Commanders in the Council's fleet were on edge, their minds racing to find any explanation, any reason for this intrusion that didn't involve mass destruction. But there was no reason. No explanation. Just that eerie stillness. It was as if the ship itself were a shadow that had crossed into their universe from another dimension. And every time they tried to scan it, tried to get a better sense of what they were up against, the ship seemed to play hide and seek with their sensors. Nothing registered. Nothing made sense. The ship didn't just avoid detection, it seemed to bend reality itself, rendering every tool at the Council's disposal useless. The tension was palpable. The Council's bravest soldiers, those who had survived battles against hostile species in galactic storms, were whispering in corners, afraid to speak their fears aloud. What if the humans weren't just different? What if they were better? Worse, what if this ship, this thing, was just the tip of the iceberg? What if the humans had entire fleets just waiting to drop from hyperspace like a pack of wolves? The Council wasn't ready for that. They were used to dealing with the occasional skirmish, the petty squabbles between species, but this was on a whole other level. In a desperate attempt to break the silence, one of the fleet commanders sent a direct communication to the human vessel. No response. It wasn't just a lack of an answer, it was the absence of a response that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. The ship wasn't just ignoring them. It was actively dismissing them, like a rich, disinterested aristocrat ignoring the pleasantries of the common folk. The arrogance was palpable, and it stung. What was worse was that the humans weren't even giving them a chance to prepare for war. They weren't sending any messages, no demands, no terms. There was no negotiation. It was a simple, brutal fact. The humans didn't need to talk. They didn't need to play by the rules. Their ship, their war machine, was the message. Council members scrambled to adjust their tactics, but the ship's movements were precise, almost preordained. They had no idea how the humans were doing it, how they had managed to infiltrate the galactic system so effortlessly. It was as though their entire fleet had mastered the art of appearing when least expected, slipping through cracks in space like they owned it. The humans weren't just playing the game, they were rewriting the rules. And then, in the middle of the Council's frantic planning, something strange happened. The human ship stopped moving entirely. It hung in space, suspended, its engines silent, its form nothing more than a shadow against the stars. For a moment, the Council held its collective breath, waiting for something to happen. Was this the calm before the storm? Were the humans preparing to launch an attack? Or was it something worse, something even more insidious? It didn't matter. Because no matter what happened next, one thing was absolutely clear: the galaxy had underestimated humanity, and it was about to pay a very steep price for it. The silence was broken by a sudden sharp flash of light, a brief, almost casual explosion, but it was enough to send a ripple of panic through the Council's ranks. The human warship had finally made its move, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. It wasn't a massive, all-out assault. No, the humans had something far more unsettling in mind. They launched a single, small craft from the belly of the beast, a sleek, menacing shape that darted through space with alarming speed. It was like watching a hawk release its prey, a quiet, deliberate act of destruction. The ship's sensors didn't know what hit them. The small craft zipped through the defense perimeter surrounding the nearest galactic outpost as though it were nothing more than a paper wall, crashing through shields like they were made of tissue paper. The outpost's defense systems, once considered state-of-the-art, sputtered and failed, as if they'd been designed by children who had never seen an actual threat. The tiny craft was in and out in mere moments, leaving behind nothing but debris and a now useless outpost. The Council fleet, still scrambling to get their act together, was left in a dazed stupor. "That wasn't supposed to happen," muttered one officer, staring blankly at the ruined outpost. It was an understatement. The humans had done what no one thought possible. They had taken down an entire station with a single, insignificant-looking craft, and all before the fleet had even been given a chance to respond. It wasn't just an attack, it was an embarrassment. Panic spread like wildfire. The Council's officers had trained for every contingency, prepared for every form of warfare except this. How had the humans managed this kind of precision? How had they outwitted the best technology the galaxy had to offer? There were no answers. There was only a growing realization that the humans had turned the tables, and they had done it without so much as a loudspeaker announcement. But the worst part, the human ship didn't even seem to care. It wasn't rushing to follow up the attack. No, it simply hung in space, silent once again, watching. It was as if the warship's crew was just waiting for the council to realize the futility of it all. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. The humans had proved their point, and now they were letting the galaxy stew in its own confusion and fear. The council scrambled for a plan. Every fleet commander, every officer, was throwing out suggestions, most of them hopelessly flawed. Launch all interceptors, one officer shouted, as if a handful of ships could stand up to a behemoth. Deploy all drones. Another suggested, though the council had an infinite supply of them ready to go. But the humans weren't worried. The small craft had already proven that it didn't need the fleet. It was enough for the warship to remain on the edges of the battlefield, observing as the council's forces crumbled. The human vessel's next move was just as calculated. It launched no more small craft. It didn't need to. Instead, it unleashed an electromagnetic pulse, one so powerful it rippled through space itself. The council's ships, their weapons, their communication systems, all of it stopped working in an instant. It was like the universe had gone on vacation, and all the council had was a broken map. The fleet was blind, helpless, a sitting duck. The humans were playing a game with no rules, and the council was the last one to realize it. It was clear now. The humans weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here for peaceful resolution. They were here to remind the galaxy of something that had been long forgotten. Humanity was not a species to be underestimated. And the council, well, it was starting to look like they had been the punchline all along. The moment the electromagnetic pulse hit, the council's fleet turned into a chaotic mess of malfunctioning systems and frenzied officers. Ships drifted aimlessly, their navigation systems completely fried. Communication lines went dead, leaving commanders yelling into silence, their orders swallowed by the void. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a spectacle. The council's once pristine fleet, built on centuries of technological dominance, now resembled a group of drunken space tourists trying to find their way home. The human warship, by comparison, remained unscathed. It was as though it had been built specifically to render every defense system in the galaxy obsolete. The council's ships had been the best for eons, but against this, they were children with toy guns facing an ancient, indestructible beast. It was like showing up to a knife fight with a spoon and realizing you're the one who's about to get skewered. In the midst of the chaos, the council's commanders tried to pull themselves together, but the humans were ahead of them at every turn. They hadn't just outmaneuvered the council, they had embarrassed it. It was one thing to lose a battle, but this felt personal. The humans weren't fighting a war, they were making a statement. They were showing the galaxy just how weak and outdated the so-called guardians of peace had become. Officers scrambled to restore their systems, attempting to get even the most basic communication up and running, but it was no use. The warship had them locked down. And still there was no response from the humans. No demands, no ultimatums, just silence. The Galactic fleet, now a helpless cluster of drifting ships, wasn't even worth their time. The council was at a loss for what to do. They had never faced anything like this. They had expected an adversary, someone they could negotiate with, someone who would offer the bare minimum of a conversation before they got to the real fighting. Instead, they were up against a species that didn't care for the rules. They didn't care about diplomacy, peace, or even making a big scene. They simply took what they wanted quietly, effortlessly, and with a swagger that made the council look like amateurs. And just when things couldn't possibly get worse, they did. The human ship, which had been hovering quietly in the distance, suddenly engaged its engines, and in an instant, it disappeared into hyperspace. No flare, no dramatic exit, just the faintest ripple of space folding in on itself, as though the ship had never been there in the first place. The council's fleet was left staring at empty space, a void that seemed to mock them. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a psychological blow. The humans hadn't just shown up to fight. They had shown up to humiliate, to erase any illusion of superiority the council had. The worst part, the council knew it wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The humans had made their point clear. They didn't need to crush the entire fleet. They only needed to remind the galaxy who the real predators were. And as the council's commanders finally began to regain some semblance of control, the truth hit harder than any blast from the human ship. The galaxy, for all its advanced technology and grand alliances, had been overtaken by a species that had been written off as irrelevant. The humans were back. And this time they weren't here to play nice. The galaxy had been warned. The question was, who would heed it? The council was still reeling, desperately trying to re-establish order after the devastating strike. Their systems flickered back to life one by one, but there was a gnawing emptiness in the pit of their collective stomachs. The human ship was gone. It had slipped into hyperspace, vanishing without a trace, leaving only the shattered remains of their pride behind. The fleet was left floating aimlessly, their battle plans in tatters, their communications a chaotic mess of static and half-broken transmissions. For the first time in centuries, the Council had no plan, no fallback, no strategy. They had always been the ones who dictated terms, the ones who set the rules, but now they were nothing more than a punchline in a galactic joke. The humans hadn't just outsmarted them, they had obliterated their sense of control. The galaxy had shifted, and it was no longer their domain. As the realization sank in, whispers began to spread across the fleet. The humans had made their point clear. They weren't just a new threat, they were the reckoning. The reminder that the Council had grown complacent. The arrogance of peace had allowed them to forget one simple truth: power never truly rests. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't ask for permission. It wasn't long before the Council scrambled to put together a response. Their diplomats were already working on damage control, drafting apologies and speeches to placate the other species in the galaxy who were watching this unfold with bated breath. But the more they tried to explain themselves, the more ridiculous it sounded. How could they explain their inability to defend against an enemy they had long dismissed as irrelevant? How could they look the galaxy in the eye and tell them that they had underestimated a species unpredictable as humanity? On the edge of their space, the Council's spy satellites picked up a disturbing signal. A faint trace of the human warship reappeared, this time closer to a neighboring star system. It wasn't a direct threat yet. It was more like a shadow moving in the distance, silently watching. The humans weren't rushing to conquer the galaxy. They weren't even sending a full fleet. They didn't need to. The humans, it seemed, had learned the art of patience. They were no longer the frantic species, stumbling from one disaster to the next. They had evolved into something far more dangerous, a calm, calculating predator. And the galaxy, with all its alliances and treaties, was nothing more than a vast, empty hunting ground. At the same time, there was a strange unease settling over the other species of the galaxy. Some were worried, yes, but others? Others were watching with something else in their eyes, something that could be described as admiration. The humans had stood up to the Council, not with grand gestures or loud speeches, but with a quiet power that cut through all the noise. It was a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, could ever truly control the galaxy. The humans had done it with one ship, a handful of attacks, and no more words than necessary. They had forced the galaxy to look at them in a way they hadn't in centuries. And so, as the Council struggled to put the pieces back together, the humans were content to watch from the sidelines. The message had been delivered. The galaxy, once so sure of its dominance, was now left wondering, was this a warning, or was it a promise? No one knew for sure. But one thing was absolutely certain: whatever the humans had in store next, the galaxy would be ready to listen. Because this time they weren't taking any chances. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizon Stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure. Stay tuned for the next chapter of humanity's rise.